You've probably felt it before, a moment where everything goes quiet, and a baby is staring at you, not blinking, not reacting, just watching. And for a few seconds, you don't know what to do. You smile, you wave, maybe you make a strange sound just to break the silence. But the baby doesn't respond the way you expect. They don't laugh, they don't look away, they just keep staring, like they're trying to figure you out. And here's the strange part. Most people think it's random, just curiosity, just undeveloped vision, just baby behavior. But what if that explanation is only scratching the surface? What if that stare is actually doing something? Something we don't usually think about, something happening inside the brain, not just the eyes. Because when researchers studied this behavior, they didn't just see a baby looking at a face. They saw something else entirely, a pattern, a system, a connection that shouldn't logically exist, but does. And it raises a disturbing question. If a baby is not just looking at you, then what exactly are they doing? Are they observing? Are they learning? Or are they thinking? And if that's true, then what does that say about the moment you make eye contact with them? What is actually being transferred in that silence? There's another detail most people miss. Babies don't stare at everything equally. They don't look at walls the same way. They don't look at objects the same way. They always come back to faces, specifically yours. And even stranger, they hold that gaze longer than expected. Like something is holding their attention in place, like they can't or don't want to look away. But here's where things start to get uncomfortable, because scientists didn't just study what babies look at, they studied what happens inside their brain during that moment. And the results don't match what most people expect. Because this isn't just looking. It's not passive. It's not random. It's something far more active, far more structured, and far more intimate. And before we explain what it actually is, there's something you need to understand first. A single idea that changes everything about this behavior. Babies are not watching the world the way we think they are. They are not seeing like adults. They are building something, right in real time, with every second they stare. And what they are building might explain why that gaze feels so intense, so focused, so strangely personal. But to understand it, we have to go deeper. Much deeper than just why they stare. We have to understand what that stare is doing. And that's where things start to get unsettling. Because the moment eye contact happens, something begins. Something you don't notice, but something that doesn't stop while it lasts. And in the next part, we're going to look at what science says is actually happening inside that moment of connection and why researchers were surprised by what they found. Most people assume there's a simple answer. Babies stare because their vision is still developing, because faces are the easiest thing to recognize, because everything else is just too complex. And for a long time, that explanation made sense. It sounded logical, safe, predictable. But science has a habit of breaking simple explanations. Because when researchers tracked how babies actually behave over time, they noticed something that didn't fit the theory. At just a few months old, babies are already capable of scanning an entire room. They can detect movement, they can distinguish objects, they can follow patterns of light and shadow. So if everything in the room is visible, why do they keep coming back to the same thing? A face, your face, over and over again. It's not just preference, it's consistency, a repeated choice that doesn't change even when the environment does. And that's where the first crack appears in the vision theory. Because if it were just about clarity, the behavior would fade as vision improves. But it doesn't, it gets stronger. Now here's where it starts to shift. Researchers began to ask a different question. Not, what are babies seeing? But, what happens when they look at someone? And that question changed everything. Because when a baby locks eyes with a person, something measurable happens. Not in behavior alone, but in physiology, in timing, in neural rhythm. The interaction stops being one-sided. It becomes coordinated. Scientists observed that during sustained eye contact, the baby's brain activity begins to align with the adult's. Not perfectly, not instantly, but in patterns, like two systems slowly adjusting to each other. This is where the idea of simple observation starts to fall apart, because observation doesn't require synchronization, but something here is synchronizing. And that leads to a disturbing realization. If two brains begin to align during eye contact, then eye contact is not just perception, it is interaction at a biological level. But there's something even more interesting. Babies don't do this with everyone equally. They don't treat every face the same way. A stranger's face triggers one type of response. A familiar caregiver's face triggers another, stronger, longer, more stable. And this suggests something important. The baby isn't just reacting to faces, they are categorizing humans in real time based on emotional familiarity. Which means every stare is not random at all. It's structured, selective, and meaningful. But here's where it becomes even more layered. Because researchers discovered something else. Babies don't just look longer at what they don't understand, they look longer at what they are actively trying to decode. So when a baby stares at you, it may not be confusion, it may not be admiration, it may be processing. A continuous attempt to extract meaning from your expression, your tone, your emotional state. In other words, your face is not just a face to them, it is data, a system of signals they are constantly learning to interpret. And that brings us to a very uncomfortable idea. If your emotions are being read in real time, then your presence is not passive in their development. It is instructional, whether you intend it or not. But we still haven't reached the most important part yet, because everything so far explains what they see, not what it does to them. And what happens next is where the science becomes much more intense than most people expect. Because eye contact is not just perception, it is also construction. And what is being constructed is something that will shape everything that comes later. In the next part, we're going to look at what happens inside the baby's brain during that stare, and why scientists believe it plays a role in building emotional intelligence itself. There's a moment in development that most people completely overlook, because nothing looks dramatic on the outside. No big reaction, no obvious change, just a baby staring. But inside the brain, something very different is happening. Researchers studying early brain development noticed something unusual. When a baby engages in sustained eye contact, certain neural systems don't just activate, they begin to organize. Not randomly, not chaotically, but in patterns that resemble coordination, like a system learning how to structure itself through interaction. And here's where the idea shifts, because the baby isn't just receiving input from you, they are using your presence as a reference point, a kind of emotional and cognitive anchor. Every facial expression you make, every shift in your eyes, every subtle change in tone becomes a signal, and the baby is constantly mapping those signals. But not in the way adults think. This isn't conscious learning. It's deeper, automatic, pre-verbal, almost like the brain is building its first model of what, and that model doesn't come from books. It doesn't come from language. It comes from you, right there, in real time. Now here's where it gets more intense. Studies in developmental neuroscience suggest that repeated face-to-face interaction is linked to stronger development in brain regions associated with emotional regulation, social understanding, decision-making later in life. But what matters here is not the list, it's the mechanism, because these systems don't develop in isolation. They develop through interaction. So when a baby looks at you, it's not passive observation, it's calibration, like a system trying to understand, what does calm look like? What does anger look like? What does safety feel like? And the only reference it has is you. That means every moment of eye contact is doing more than bonding. It is shaping internal expectations about people, about the world, about emotional safety. And that's where things become quietly powerful, because you are not just present in their life, you are part of how their brain defines reality. But there's another layer most people don't think about, because babies don't just respond to what you do, they respond to what you are in that moment. Your stress level, your patience, your stillness, your tension, even when you say nothing. And over time, those micro signals become part of their internal map of human behavior. Which leads to something very important. A baby is not learning from instruction. They are learning from exposure, constant exposure, So that long stare, that silent, unbroken eye contact is not just curiosity. It is data collection at the most fundamental level. And now the implication becomes harder to ignore. Because if a baby is building their understanding of the world through your face, then you are not just interacting with them, you are structuring how they interpret reality itself. But even this is not the full picture, because there's something else happening at the same time. Something researchers only began to understand in more recent studies. That eye contact is not one-directional. It is mutual, and in some cases, biologically synchronized. Which raises a deeper question. If two nervous systems begin to align during interaction, where does self begin and where does other end? And in the next part, we're going to explore what scientists found when they started measuring real-time emotional mirroring between caregiver and infant, and why it changes the way we understand connection itself. There's a type of silence that feels different, not empty, not peaceful, but connected. It happens when a baby is looking at you and you are looking back. No words, no movement, just eye contact. And in that moment, something subtle begins to happen, something you can't see directly, but science can measure it. Researchers studying caregiver-infant interaction found something unexpected. During sustained emotional engagement, the physiological states of both begin to shift in relation to each other. Heart rate patterns, breathing rhythms, microfacial responses, even emotional arousal levels. They don't become identical, but they begin to align. Not because one controls the other, but because both are responding to the same feedback loop, a loop that is created simply by presence. And that is where the idea of connection becomes something more physical than emotional. Because it is not just feeling, it is regulation. A baby does not yet have full control over emotional regulation, so they borrow it from the environment, from the interaction, from you. Which means your emotional state becomes a kind of external reference system, a stabilizer, a guide. When you are calm, their system slows down. When you are tense, their system tightens. When you are present and steady, their nervous system begins to settle into that pattern. But this is not conscious imitation. It is deeper than learning behavior. It is biological alignment. Now here's where it becomes even more interesting. This alignment does not require words. It does not require teaching. It only requires attention, mutual attention. And eye contact is one of the strongest triggers for that mechanism, because eye contact removes distance, not physically, but neurologically. It turns two separate systems into a shared loop of feedback. But here's the part most people never think about. This loop is not neutral. It shapes emotional interpretation. Over time, repeated interactions like this help the infant form internal expectations about how relationships feel. Whether people are safe, whether attention is stable, whether connection is predictable. So what looks like a simple stare is actually a training environment for emotional regulation, for social understanding, for trust. And this is where things take a subtle turn, because if emotional states can synchronize through interaction, then the boundary between self and other starts to blur in early development. Not in a mystical sense, but in a developmental one. The brain is still learning where it ends and the world begins. And the caregiver becomes part of that boundary definition, which means every calm response, every steady gaze, every moment of emotional presence is not just comfort, it is structure. But there is still one missing piece, because everything so far explains connection, but not what happens when that connection is interrupted. And researchers found something very revealing when they studied what happens when the gaze suddenly breaks, when the face goes still, when responsiveness disappears. And the infant tries to repair it, again and again, until something else happens entirely. In the next part, we're going to look at what happens when that connection fails, and why it reveals just how important that stare really is. There's a moment in interaction that feels almost invisible at first because everything looks normal, a face, a presence, a baby looking at you. And then suddenly, something changes. Not in the baby, not immediately, but in the response. The face becomes still. No smile, no reaction, no emotional feedback, just blank. This is what researchers call the still face condition. And what happens next is one of the most studied patterns in developmental science. At first, the baby tries to fix it. They don't understand what's wrong. So they do what has always worked before. They increase engagement. They smile more. They vocalize. They move their hands. They try to reestablish connection. Because in their experience, connection is supposed to respond. It is supposed to bounce back. It is supposed to continue. But when nothing changes, the system starts to escalate. The signals become stronger, more urgent, less coordinated. And then something shifts. The attempt changes from communication to regulation effort, as if the baby is trying to repair not just attention, but emotional stability itself. And when the feedback still doesn't return, another shift happens. The system begins to withdraw. Not immediately, not dramatically, but gradually, like a signal losing strength. Facial expression reduces, movement slows, engagement drops, and what replaces it is not calm. It is disengagement, a kind of emotional shutdown. Now here's what makes this important. This reaction is not about being ignored in the adult sense. It is about disrupted regulation. Because the baby is not just interacting with a face, they are interacting with a system that helps them organize internal state. So when that system goes offline, the infant doesn't just feel confusion. They experience a breakdown in predictability. And researchers observe something even more striking. When the normal expression returns, the recovery is not instant. The baby does not immediately re-engage at the same level. There is hesitation, recalibration, a slow return to baseline interaction, which suggests something important. Emotional connection is not just moment to moment. It has memory, even in its earliest form. And this leads to a deeper insight. Because what the still face experiment shows is not just how fragile attention is, but how dependent early development is on responsive interaction. The baby is not passive. They are actively maintaining a system of connection, constantly testing. Are you still there? Are you still responding? Is this safe? And when the answer becomes unclear, the system destabilizes. But here's where the meaning deepens. This isn't just about distress. It is about learning. Because through this cycle of attempt, failure, and recovery, the infant begins to understand something fundamental about people. That connection is not guaranteed. That response is not automatic. That emotional stability depends on reciprocity. And this becomes part of their internal model of relationships. Before language, before memory, before explanation. Just experience, repeated, encoded. So that simple experiment is not really about a still face. It is about what happens when a developing mind loses the feedback it depends on to stay regulated. And what it reveals is that the stare is not one-sided at all. It is a system of mutual regulation. But there is still one final layer left, because everything so far explains behavior and emotional development, but not the long-term meaning, not what all of this is building toward. In the final part, we're going to bring everything together and understand why this simple act, eye contact between a baby and a caregiver, may actually be one of the most important building blocks of human consciousness itself. By now, the pattern should feel impossible to ignore. A baby looks at you, and you look back, and something happens in between that space. Not visible, not verbal, but real. Because what started as just staring turns out to be something far more fundamental. It is construction, not of behavior, not of habits, but of something deeper. The early architecture of how a human mind understands other humans. Every moment of eye contact is adding structure. Every response is reinforcing prediction. Every emotional reaction becomes data. And slowly, a system is being built. A system that will later become trust, empathy, emotional control, social understanding. But in the beginning, it is none of those things yet. It is just patterns, repeated enough times to become internal rules. And here's the part that changes the perspective completely. The baby is not learning from what you say. They are learning from what you are, in real time, without filters, without interpretation. Which means the stare is not passive observation. It is active modeling. You are not being watched like an object. You are being used as a reference system, a living example of how emotional reality works. And that has a quiet implication. The caregiver is not separate from development. They are part of it. Not as a teacher, not as a guide, but as the environment that shapes how the mind organizes itself. And this is why those long moments of eye contact feel so intense, because something is happening that doesn't use language yet, something that existed before memory, before explanation, before identity. Just connection, direct, unfiltered, immediate. And maybe that is why it feels strange when a baby stares for too long, because it is not just seeing you, it is mapping you, in real time, as a model for understanding the world. And when you realize that, the meaning of that moment changes, completely. It is no longer just a baby looking at a face. It is a developing mind using another human being as the foundation for how reality is interpreted. And that is the final truth researchers keep circling back to in different ways. Human development does not begin in isolation. It begins in relationship. So when a baby locks eyes with you, and the world seems to pause for a second, it is not emptiness. It is not confusion. It is construction. And you are part of it, whether you notice it or not. So the next time it happens, that silent, unbroken gaze, you might not see it the same way again. Because behind it is the beginning of how a human mind learns what it means to be human.